Well, good morning, friends. Today is August 14th, and we are beginning the 33rd week of reading through the Bible together in this process we're calling Gathering Together Around God's Word. And this is a fun week because this is when we begin the New Testament. And so we are finally, after all that time, we are here. We're in the New Testament. And so if you're following along but you haven't been able to read much, this is a really good time to plug back in and try to read, because the New Testament is a lot more manageable than the Old Testament. It will be much more familiar, and the readings by and large after we get through the Gospels are pretty short. You'll notice that the next couple of months, as we walk through I guess it's like the first weekend of January, the readings will be substantially shorter than they've been prior to this. So I really recommend and encourage you to dig back in if you haven't been reading. If you're not able to maintain the reading schedule, that's fine. You're obviously welcome to jump in on classes as you're able. But if not, this might be a good time to try again. Another quick update, the podcast was having some issues on the Minor Prophets. Some of y'all had emailed me about that. It wasn't downloading, but it is fixed and you can download it now. And so those links are in the email. And we'll be putting out another, probably this week, another podcast on the rest of the Minor Prophets. We covered the first 6 and we'll cover the last 6 in this next one. And then one last thing is I've updated the handout a tiny bit, and I'll send that out in the email, but it's nothing major. So today we're going to get into Matthew, and I wanted to stop before we get into Matthew and just mention a couple of things to kind of prepare us as we read through the gospel with this wealth of information that we're bringing to it, right? We're coming to the gospels now, having gone through the entire Old Testament, having heard sermons, having read, having gone through classes or listened to podcasts. And so I'm hoping that when you enter into the Gospels, you'll have a much deeper appreciation for how Jewish the Gospels are, and a richer sense of the Gospels. And I'll talk about that a little bit in this class, but just pay attention to a lot of the things you wouldn't normally pick up on now when you read the Gospels. Also pay attention to how this kind of momentum that we were seeing in some of the books of the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets, but other books like Daniel and Ezekiel are getting picked up in the Gospels. Things like resurrection, the power of prophecy, and in particular around justice, these ideas of taking care of each other and economic inequality. When we're seeing in Ezekiel and Daniel, not only are we seeing resurrection, but we're seeing language around apocalypse and this idea that God breaks into human history and reveals new things. These are all being picked up in the gospel, in some ways in a kind of continuity, and in other ways utilizing these themes or ideas, but in kind of dramatically new ways. And so I just think it's going to be a really cool thing to dig into the Gospels with all of this behind us. I was just, in preparing for Matthew in the past week, was just seeing so many things that I don't normally pick up on. Do y'all have any questions before we dig into the New Testament and specifically Matthew? Okay. Well, then we'll get into Matthew. I'm gonna spend a couple moments talking about Matthew, just introducing the material. Then we're going to talk about our subject today, which is what I'm calling Jesus and the Disinherited. And then we're going to do some readings. Matthew is the first gospel in the in the New Testament, but it is not the oldest gospel. That would be Mark. Matthew, though, was the most quoted by the early church writers. Some accounts that it was quoted more than double any other gospel. And it was probably the gospel that has the most direct links to the Old Testament. So these are some of the reasons that Matthew is placed at the beginning, even though it is not the oldest. Mark is the oldest gospel, and Matthew borrows heavily from Mark. And one of the things that Matthew does is he takes the general framework of Mark And Mark can largely be discussed geographically, right? There's this overarching journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And what Matthew does is takes that as a kind of framework and adds some narrative elements. And some of the narrative elements he adds are things that are very just common. We think about them all the time, but they're not in Mark. So the first would be the nativity scene and the genealogy that begin Matthew. You don't find that in Mark. And then the second part would be the resurrection appearances and the commissioning of the disciples. So Matthew essentially adds a beginning and an end to Mark that's not there. If you remember, the original edition of Mark just leaves us with an empty tomb. In addition to that, one of the main features that Matthew adds to Mark are discourses. So pay attention as you're reading through Matthew, how important the teachings and how extended these teachings of Jesus are. There's 5 of these, and I'm going to actually pull up the handout right now to show you something. So if you look in the 3rd paragraph on the front page of your handout, and I've got it up here on the screen if you want to just look at that, I've put it right here. These are vital and so important to the overall structure and theme and focus of Matthew, are these 5 major discourses. And they're kind of spread out. A lot of them we're familiar with, right? Like 5 through 7 is the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. They're very familiar parts, but they're so extended and we don't really get these in Mark. And what Matthew does is he essentially structures the narrative around these discourses. So the discourses are the central part, and the narrative is what kind of just keeps you going to get to the next discourse. Each of these discourse ends with an editorial conclusion when Jesus had finished saying these things. There's great intentionality on the writer of Matthew's part about what's going on, and about saying that this discourse is ended and now we're transitioning to a narrative section. Another quick thing about that is that these 5 major discourses, a lot of scholars point to Matthew trying to connect Jesus to Moses. And so many people say that these 5 discourses are almost paralleling the 5 books of the Torah, right? So Moses was traditionally held to have written the 5 books of the Torah. And so they think this is an intentional division by the author of Matthew to make another connection to Moses. The author of Matthew was traditionally held to be Matthew, the disciple and former tax collector, but most scholars don't believe that's true. Most scholars point to someone that was writing around 80 or 90 AD. So Mark was probably written around 70. And so a couple years after that, Matthew's writing. Matthew was written by someone that is Jewish, most likely a scribe, someone that's familiar with that Jewish tradition and argumentation. They were most likely living in Antioch, which is in present-day Syria. There's a lot of reasons behind this, but a couple are this was an intellectual hub, and there was a good-sized Jewish exile community there. And also they were Hellenized, and therefore they spoke Greek, and that's what the gospel is written in. I mentioned that this person was Jewish, and that's really important because as you read through Matthew, it's the most Jewish of the Gospels. There's a lot of Jewish elements to it that are explicit. Matthew's writing to a largely Jewish community. Even at the time when the word Christian was used, they were still thought of as kind of a sect of Judaism and not something completely separate from Judaism. And so even if they identified Christ as the Messiah, they're largely identifying still as Jewish. And that's kind of hard for us to think of now that 2,000 years have passed, but this element's super important to it. And also that Matthew's kind of doing an evangelical technique and saying, you know, Jesus is Jewish. Jesus comes from this Jewish tradition, and look at all these things. So there's a couple of elements that I can point out. Poetic parallelism, like we'd see in the Psalms or other Old Testament poetry, you'll see throughout Matthew. The focus on piety, obedience, discipline, those are very Jewish things. The idea that baptism is a rite of initiation into a community was very popular at the time. And then this focus on the community. Matthew is the only gospel to use the word church or ecclesia in Greek. And that idea of the community of believers was really important and is ultimately a very Jewish thing. Yeah, I think I'll stop there with the Jewish elements, but that's something that you'll see a lot of. Oh, another one is emphasis on the law. The law is very important in Matthew, and you'll see that throughout. So some thematic focuses of Matthew are opposition to religious establishment and Pharisaism. I don't know the word there. Opposed to the Pharisees. Matthew is openly antagonistic to the Pharisees and to the religious establishment of the day. There's subtle anti-Romanism, so kind of going against the Roman Empire, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There's a huge focus, and in fact, I would probably argue that one of the biggest focuses of Matthew is obedience. Matthew is very much a manual for what it means to be a disciple. Matthew is laying out that Christian faith is not just belief, but a way of life, a way of living, a way of moving through the world. And what Matthew is doing is trying to give kind of a schematic for what that looks like. So obedience, discipleship, righteousness, all these things are kind of a central focus. There is apocalyptic elements, and these play throughout all the Gospels, but you'll see that in Matthew. And then another quick thing is Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the Torah, of the law and the prophets. And so what we're seeing throughout the Old Testament, this emphasis on the law, the covenant, and then the prophets focus on justice and covenant lifestyle being lived out. We're seeing Jesus Christ portrayed as the fulfillment of that. And then the kingdom of heaven is a big part of Matthew. And what happens in Matthew, and you'll see this idea of kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven is portrayed in different ways in the Gospels, but in Matthew, it's portrayed as Jesus is starting the kingdom of heaven, and the disciples, through obedient living, through evangelicalism, are going to be continuing the kingdom of heaven. And we'll talk about what that means and what that looks like. Jesus is portrayed in different ways throughout Matthew, but 5 that I've listed, and you can see this in your handout, are Jesus is portrayed as a Moses-like teacher, a compassionate healer, the Messiah or the Son of David, the royal Son of God, so a king, but also the Son of God. And then lastly is the apocalyptic Son of Man. So Matthew is portraying Jesus in different lights, and those are some of the ways that he portrays him. We're going to focus on, well, it's not easy to put it into one box, but I think compassionate healer is a big part of what we're going to look at today. And I'm going to stop there for a second and see if y'all have any introductory questions before I transition to our focus on Jesus and the Disinherited. Any questions on Matthew overall? Okay, well, let's talk about the focus today, and that's Jesus and the Disinherited. I'm taking this title from a really good book. Excuse me, I'm going to pull up my handout. You see this quote at the beginning. This is from a book by Howard Thurman. It cannot be denied that too often the weight of the Christian movement has been on the side of the strong and the powerful and against the weak and oppressed. This despite the gospel. This is a powerful book by Howard Thurman, who was kind of a progenitor of the civil rights movement and a big influence on Martin Luther King and other civil rights icons. Howard Thurman was a Black pastor that began one of the nation's first integrated churches. So he ran a church that was open to having whites and Blacks worship in the same space. He was a mystic in many ways, very spiritually oriented, but also deeply involved in kind of social justice. Jesus and the Disinherited is a great book and a great place to start with Thurman. And Thurman was actually born in Florida, I think right outside of Jacksonville. So he has got a little connection to us. Um, this idea of the disinherited is a really important one. And I think, when we're talking about the Gospel of Matthew, it's really easy to get caught up in talking about a specific angle and saying, this is what the gospel is about. That's not what I'm trying to do today. What I'm trying to do is show an angle of what the gospel is about. So don't take this as whole cloth. This is all that the gospel is about. The gospel is about a ton of different things, but this is one element, and it's one that I think is important. And I'm especially interested in talking about this because we are coming right from the minor prophets. When we were talking about the minor prophets, specifically the 8th century minor prophets like Hosea, Micah, Amos, what's happening at that point in time is that society went from a village-based communal infrastructure to one that is hierarchical, mercantile, and a huge gap is growing between the rich and the poor. And essentially the rich are getting richer off the poor. And so what the prophets are doing, the minor prophets are doing, is they're responding to that. They're saying this is not right. This is not what God wants. And this goes counter to the kind of covenant lifestyle that that God initiated through Moses, right? So when you think about Deuteronomy and Exodus, there's all this language about taking care of your neighbor, about being there for the one in need, taking care of the widow and the orphan, looking out after the stranger or the alien or the foreigner. And what happens is, as these kind of monarchies get in place in Israel and in Judah, that gets disrupted. There's wealth accumulation, there's land accumulation, and this disparity grows between the rich and the poor. And the rich essentially utilize their power and their wealth to increase their power and wealth. And so when we get into the Gospels, it's been 800 years since that's happened. But society is still kind of structured in this way that is counter to a covenant lifestyle. So the Roman Empire in this day and age is largely a commercialized, it's an expansive empire, right? But it's largely agrarian. It's advanced agrarian, but it's largely agrarian. And so what happens is there's a couple of families that typically rule. And those families are the powerful. They're led by men. And essentially everyone else is at their whim to serve them. So farmers, fishermen, bureaucrats, the military, everyone is kind of set up in society to serve these rich landowning families. And so what happens is you have an upper class and a lower class and no middle class whatsoever. And so the society is deeply, deeply stratified. And it's deeply in ways that we would talk about today as being economically unjust. There's no kind of opportunity for those on the lower class. And they're often kind of pushed off to the fringe of society. So Jesus kind of comes into this setting. That's where the Gospels take place. They're in the Roman Empire. And Jesus is on the fringes of society, right? He's essentially poor. He comes from a poor family. He hangs out with fishermen who are poor and on the fringes of society. And he interacts with people that would be considered outcast or lowly. Women, children, the sick, the ill, those in need, widows, orphans. These are all people that are on the outskirts. But as good readers of the Bible that we are, we know that this is what God calls us towards. Those kind of people, right? Like widows, orphans, the sick, the ill, those in need. That's what the covenant is about. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this today, because I think it's so intimately connected to where we've come from, and also this push that we were seeing in the minor prophets to return to that kind of lifestyle. A couple quick other things about this is when you think about the Gospel of Matthew, think about, this is kind of hard for us to pick up today because we're so removed from that, but think about how these things would have been dangerous to Rome. Jesus comes from the Davidic line, right? So the Davidic line, the kingly line, and Rome has been at war. Rome occupies Israel, but there's been wars in the past where Israel tried to free themselves. If you have a Bible that has the apocryphal books in it, You can look at Maccabees. Maccabees talks all about this when there's a revolt of the Jewish folks looking for independence against Rome. There is a star and 3 kings come to identify Jesus as unique, and that is a threat to Herod. Jesus hung out with John the Baptist, who was killed by Herod Antipas as a threat. Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, which would be counter to the kind of kingdom of the world or the Roman Empire. Jesus is in contention with the priestly establishment, and the priestly establishment at this time is deeply embedded with Rome. And lastly, Jesus dies under Pilate, who is a Roman governor, and dies through execution by crucifixion, which was largely reserved for political rebels. And that was to make a kind of spectacle, intentionally so, saying if you go against the Roman Empire, this is what's going to happen to you. So all of these elements aren't trying to, the gospel is not like overtly making Jesus anti-Roman, but there are subtle elements that kind of take swipes at Roman power and the Roman economic structure. And so that's what this class is about, is Jesus and the Disinherited. The ways that Jesus kind of spoke against the status quo and talked about a kingdom of heaven where those on the fringes of normal everyday society in Rome were actually part of the center of God's kingdom, that were being brought into the circle and not pushed out to the fringes. And so what we're going to look at is some instances of that. Any questions on this before we dig into the readings?
Well,
yeah, Rob?
Yeah, am I on? Can you hear?
You're on.
Okay, good. Paul writes the first documents in the New Testament. And it's interesting that, especially in Romans, Paul talks about being obedient to the civil authorities, and that God places the civil authorities, including the emperor, in position. So what we have, Matthew is writing after Paul's letters, 10, 20 years after Romans and Galatians and those letters. And I wonder if your sense is that there's a souring of the writers of the New Testament toward the Roman authorities between the time that Paul is writing, and in a sense, in a very conservative way, saying these are people that have authority from God and we must obey them, to what you're saying, which we can see in Matthew, where it's like, well, there's a spiritual kingdom that's involved here too, and the poor are being left behind. What's your thought? Do you think there was an evolution of that view toward authority, or what?
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to talk about a linear evolution because there's various elements within the larger Christian church as it grows. I do think Paul's probably more deferential than we see Jesus in the Gospels. I don't think Jesus is like an outright rebel by any means, but there is a clear distinction Christ is drawing between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of the world. And there's obviously lots of examples of that. I think Paul's deferential. I don't know that Paul would ultimately side with Rome over God's authority, but I think Paul is definitely more deferential.
It'll be interesting when we get to Paul's writings to see some of those passages, because they're quoted even today by lots of people, and so we'll wait for that Sunday.
Yeah, I think that we could have like 400 classes on that, and I don't think it's I think people misuse it, is the way I would put it.
I agree.
But digging back into this, I want to ask a question of y'all to kind of frame our reading today, and that are, what are ways that the church perpetuates societal divisions today? What are ways that the church today perpetuates societal divisions?
The manner in which some Christian churches judge and claim that they're right and everyone else is wrong.
Okay, thanks. What else?
Bill,
Yes,
can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, to add, the Thurman book is excellent. A couple of years ago, I was introduced to a biblical scholar named Warren Carter. You may be familiar with him. And his commentary on Matthew is entitled Matthew and the Margins. And he acknowledges there are many perspectives you can take, but he focuses on how people are at the margin, and that Matthew is much more anti-empire than we may think. And what concerns me today is, let's just take one example, ability to vote. We seem to be pushing more and more people to the who are already on the margin further away, and sometimes those doing that claim to be followers of Jesus Christ.
Yep. Thanks. What else?
That the churches, those churches that preach the prosperity gospel are pretty much anti the gospel in my opinion, but
Yeah, so that almost kind of the prosperity gospel almost perpetuates this kind of rich poor element, and also it kind of makes one dimension out of the gospel and just sees it through the lens of wealth. What are other ways that the church perpetuates societal divisions?
Well, the most segregated hour is still probably 11 o'clock Sunday morning in America.
Yep, that's a great point, and one that we can see by just looking at who's attending right now, right?
Okay?
This isn't it. This is just the reality of churches across the country. They're very racially divided. We kind of self-identify and separate ourselves.
I mean,
Anything else?
I would say those churches that don't allow women to preach or be pastors or whatever would also fall into that category.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And there's actually Presbyterian churches that do that. So not Presbyterian Church of USA like we are, but PCA is a church that's in Tampa, and women aren't allowed to be pastors. Rob?
Yeah, well, just a comment. When I was working with the Presbyterian Church in Venezuela, I would often speak in front of Venezuelan or Colombian Presbyterian churches. And I became very used to half of the population having much darker skin than I had. And I would often be the person with the lightest skin in the whole congregation. And so that just became normal for me and my family. And when we came back to the USA and started speaking in churches, I commented to Helen that I couldn't believe that there were no darker people in the congregation. And there'd be maybe 500 people there to hear this missionary from South America preach a sermon. And I would look out, and it just shook me that, wow, how different than our Presbyterian brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, where there's so much more of a mixing. That just a comment that goes into this thing, and it just really struck me, and still does today.
Thanks. So I'm gonna dig into the text, but I want you to think about this as we're looking through these things, and think about the message that Jesus is putting out there, and think about the ways we hear that message, and the ways that we either live or do not live out that message, and the ways that there are new societal divisions maybe that didn't exist in Jesus's time but do in ours. So our first reading, I want to just briefly look, and if you've got your Bible, you can follow along, but I'll share my screen too. I want us to look at Matthew 1. So this is the genealogy, and this is why Matthew is such a great book to begin the New Testament, because it begins with this genealogy that is connecting Jesus back to David and Abraham. We're seeing all these names that we saw in Genesis, right? And then we get into First and Second Kings with all these names like David, Solomon, Rehoboam. Remember, Rehoboam is when the kingdom split. And then all these other names like Uzziah and Hezekiah and Manasseh, Josiah. These are all names, right? We heard these in First and Second Kings. These are familiar to us. And then if you look here, y'all remember from our readings of Haggai and Zechariah when they're trying to rebuild the temple? Zerubbabel, right? Zerubbabel was the governor of Judah at the time. So these names are so much more familiar to us now reading through it than they might have been in previous readings. But for today, I want you to think about in this day and age, that there's a huge distinction between Jews and Gentiles, and women are so far below men in the kind of hierarchy of Roman society. And what does Matthew do in his genealogy? Well, we have 4 women named. So we have Rahab, Ruth, Uriah's wife. It doesn't name Bathsheba, and then Tamar. Okay, so there's 4 women named. So already we're including in a genealogy that's trying to indicate that Jesus is deeply embedded within this tradition and has links to David and to Abraham and to the Jewish community. Matthew is essentially already expanding the circle of kind of who's in and who's out. And so we're including 4 women. And these 4 women, only one is Jewish, Tamar. We have Rahab, who was the prostitute that let Joshua, the spies in, right? In the promised land. And then Ruth, a Moabite, and Bathsheba, was married to Uriah, who was a Hittite. So these women are not only women, but they're women from kind of outside the circle of Israel. And so Matthew's already drawing the boundaries a little bigger than we would expect. But I want to jump now to chapter 4 and look at verses 23 through 25. And Rob, would you read these?
Sure. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he cured them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan.
Thanks. So already at the beginning of the gospel, Jesus is beginning his ministry. And his ministry doesn't just involve teaching, right? But it involves reaching out to those on the fringe of society, specifically the ill. If you look through Matthew has Jesus healing every corner you turn, Jesus is healing someone. And in this day and in the age, those that are sick, that are ill, are held to be kind of outcast on the fringe of society. Something's wrong with them. Even in a kind of religious context, people often thought they were being punished by God. And Jesus begins his ministry going out to these people. And I love this passage because it says all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, paralytics, he cured them. So Jesus is not only interacting with these people on the fringe of society, he's welcoming them in through relationship, and he's healing them. He's curing them of their illnesses. Let's jump to 5, and this is the Beatitudes. This is familiar, but listen to the language and who is kind of centered in these stories, and the emphasis given on those people. Richard, Jewel, do you mind reading these 12 verses? I can make it a little bigger.
The Beatitudes, not all. Thank you.
Yep.
When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Thanks, Richard. What sticks out in this passage, this Beatitudes of the teaching? Who's Jesus talking about here, and what is Jesus saying about these various groups or types of people?
Good reader.
What do you think about when you hear the Beatitudes?
I think about the disenfranchised. And I think about how I have felt disenfranchised for a lot of reasons. And I feel as if Jesus was speaking to me because of that. Because of that less than feeling.
Yeah, the disenfranchised is a great word. Let me ask you a question. When you go on your computer, like on social media, or you go and watch TV, who are the folks that are lifted up on TV? Who are the folks that are lifted up in commercials? Who are the folks that are lifted up in advertisements on social media? I thought I heard someone say something in class. No?
Anyone with the name of Kardashian.
So the Kardashians, right? Young, beautiful, wealthy, right? What else? What other things do we kind of centralize in our narratives today? What kind of folks? The rich and famous, the winners, good.
Successful.
The successful, good.
The
All right,
instigators.
All right, now let's look. Poor, mourn, meek, those who seek for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, peacemakers. These are so counter to society in first century Palestine, but they're still counter to society today, and in many ways even more so now with the spread of media and advertisements, right? And so I think the message that Jesus is lifting up, it goes against the status quo of the day. It counters the kind of vision, image of what is power, what is good, what is right, and really takes an opposite swipe at that. But the point being is this is still such a contemporary message, right? When we read Amos, we talked about how contemporary the message of Amos was, about the disparity of the rich and the poor. And I think when we're getting in the Gospels, we see the same thing. This goes so counter to society today. And I think we're so inundated with these images that we don't even question it anymore. It's just kind of part of life, right? We laugh when we hear the Kardashians, but if we step back, it's so counter to this kind of lifestyle that Christ is calling us to, that's deeply embedded in this covenant tradition of caring for those in need, of not judging people on appearances or wealth, of taking a counter and saying, the folks that are poor, the folks that are hurt, the folks that are mourning, the folks that have no power, those are the ones who are blessed. Those are the ones that God is centering. Those are the ones that God is calling into the fold.
These made the people in power uncomfortable.
Right, right. And
Now-
it's a deeply threatening message in ways that
Right.
I think it's hard for us to understand because we're so familiar with these texts.
I don't know if it's hard for us to understand when we look at Florida and realize that there's a law that prevents us from making white people uncomfortable because of the systemic racism that's been perpetrated by our state. And now it's the anti-wokeness. I mean, it's the analogy is there. I mean, so it's in our face.
Yeah, the danger of the gospel, I think a lot of times is our familiarity with it. We don't read into how much of a challenge it is to the status quo, not only of the Roman Empire, but of life today. Rob?
Yeah, Will, in your opinion, these comments were written down when the church, the Christians had no power, had no civic power. The Romans had all the power, and they stressed their might and their military. My hunch is that once the church became the official faith of the Roman Empire, the situation changed. Then the Christians became the ones on top.
Mhm.
And the bishops and the archbishops, the cardinals, were basically in bed with the Roman officials. And these passages here become more uncomfortable because they're speaking to people who are without power, who are following the way of Jesus Christ, who was a servant to the poor. And I still think we're at that same point where we still have people that say we're a Christian nation. I don't agree with that, but we still have people that say that. And I'm just wondering your thought on that. It seems to me that the context is different, especially after the empire adopts Christianity and uses Christian, the Christian faith to bless all that the empire does and paints crosses on the swords, the shields of the legions. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that when Christianity becomes the state religion under Constantine, things shift in a lot of ways, and some for the worse. I also think it's important to see where the focus of the church is. We read Acts, and it talks about spreading the word, about taking care of each other, praying for each other, living and sharing all things in common. And, you know, as the empire goes, we get into like, not that they're unimportant, but the focus becomes these kind of theological arguments that I think in many ways can become diversions from the social and economic message of the gospel. Yeah. And so I think we like to kind of tame the gospel through discussions of other things sometimes. And those things are just distractions from the radical message of Christ and the kingdom of heaven. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we do that ourselves, right? We like to read Amos, but we also like our things, and Amos deeply challenges that on an individual level and a communal level, and it's hard to read. I mean, the gospel should be hard to read for us. That's the point of it. It should challenge us. I'm not saying you need to go out and sell all your belongings tomorrow, but it's going to make you think about things like that, and think about, you know, what are you doing with your wealth, and how are you treating those around you that are different from you. Let's dig back in. Oh, Ed.
I hesitate to quote him, but Bill Wallach used to say that we act like Pharisees. And that as many people as are bringing people into the boat, there's parts of our community pushing people out of the boat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The whitewashed tombs comes to mind, right? Looks pretty on the outside. I think I think the gospel should always be hard to read, should always be a challenge to us, and should always leave us asking questions in ways that hopefully are transforming our behaviors. None of us are perfect and none of us ever will be, but it's easy to use religion as a weapon like the Pharisees did. That's easy. We can use it to exclude others, to judge people. The hard thing is to use the gospel as something that opens up the circles of the people that we interact and care for. And that's what the gospel is doing. It's expanding this circle of who God cares about and who God is calling us to care about. We've got, oh geez, we've only got 10 minutes, even less than that left. Let me, well, I'll pull up a couple quick things and then I want us to look at one specifically. So let me see here. So here's Jesus cleansing a leper, someone on the fringes of society, interacting with them. Jesus touches them, right? This is just so weird, right? He's touching a leper. That's a strange thing. That's not supposed to happen. That goes against religious rules. Here in Matthew 14, again, we see Jesus interacting with those that are ill, those that are sick, and they're rushing towards him. And then I wanted to look at this story in particular. Lee Barks, I wonder if you could read this passage from Matthew 15. Oh, Lee, you're muted.
Right? Sorry,
Yep.
I thought you just unmuted. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly.
Thanks, Lee. This is such an awesome passage for so many reasons, right? Jesus is interacting with a woman. She's a woman that is not from Israel. She has a child who is sick. There's this contentious part where Jesus is arguing with her, and it's hard to read for a lot of us that think of Jesus as this really friendly guy. This is like, what is this? What Jesus is this? But I think one of the things that's happening here is you're seeing a dialogue between Jesus and this woman. And even though it is contentious, right? In this day and age, rabbis showed respect to each other by arguing. It was a sign of respect to engage theologically with each other. And so in many ways, I think Jesus is almost, although he's kind of contentious, there is an element of respect in here. He's treating her as an equal and having a conversation with her. And I think that's proven by the fact that Jesus changes through this interaction with this woman. It's just such a beautiful passage. And then it ends with a healing part. And so I just think it really captures this element of Jesus talking to those who are lower in society, Jesus treating them as equals, and then this healing element for her daughter. I want to just look at two quick things and then open it back up to discussion at the end. In the feeding of the 4,000, this is the second one. The first is the feeding of the 5,000. Just notice that Jesus sees this crowd of people and has compassion for the crowd because they are hungry and doesn't want to send them away, but rather bring them in and find ways to feed them. What a wonderful just summation of the gospel. Compassion leads to action, even in the face of seeming impossibility. That should just be a message for all of us about what it means to be a Christian, to see the seemingly impossible, but through compassion to make care possible, compassion lived out. Matthew 19 has Jesus blessing little children. And if you see here, the disciples do their part in fulfilling society and saying, we don't want these little rats around us. Get these little kids out of here. That's how children were thought of. We think of children as cute and cuddly, as deserving of our love. But in this day and age, they were seen as kind of the bottom rung of society. And yet Jesus says, let the little children come to me and do not stop them. For it is such to these that the kingdom of heaven belongs. And probably the best passage, but the one we're most familiar with, is the sheep and the goats, or the judgment of the nations. The point being here is that Jesus identifies himself with those that are hungry, thirsty, in prison, naked. That's who Jesus is. Jesus is with these people. And if we want to have a relationship with Christ, we are called to serve and be in relationship with them. I wish we could dig into this. Matthew is chock full of these examples. I put a bunch of them on your handout, and feel free to look at these. But I want to just quickly, before we go to prayer, what are some quick ways that you think that we as Christians today can be better about upsetting the status quo, about upsetting societal divisions today? It can be small, it can be big. What are some things we can do?
We work with Hope.
That's a great example.
And Hope is trying to get it at systemic solutions of systemic problems.
And it's doing it in a way that's bringing Christians of various backgrounds and ethnicities and races together.
Yep. And even Muslim. And
Yeah, that's right.
Hopefully
Yeah.
soon a synagogue will be joining us.
Yeah.
But I concur. We challenge the status quo. We bring it up. We put it in the face of. We state the truth.
Yeah.
Even when those people don't want to hear the truth and revile us for bringing the truth.
Thanks. What are some other ways we can upset the status quo? What are other ways that we can live the gospel out? If you just said something in class, I could barely hear you. Oh, I guess no one said anything. What else?
I think and I'm sitting here puzzling, I think that's instructive. Instead of a lot of responses to your question, we're in some ways puzzled.
Mm.
And I think and I'm a part of it. That's a part of where we are. We're not sure.
Yeah.
Now, take the gospel seriously.
Well, it's a good question to leave us with and to think throughout the day and the weeks ahead as we read the Gospels. I really want to lift up too that just saying hi to someone is a really good way to upset the status quo. It's call a friend, say hi to your neighbor. These are little tiny acts. There's big acts too if you want to join Hope. There's everything in between. Lots to do. I also want to lift up that Christ makes no division between worship, faith, and social justice. They are intimately connected. And that's the same thing we see throughout the prophets. It's not just going out and caring for people. It's that this is an immediate reaction to being a faithful person, that going to worship, that being in community compels us to go out into the world and care for others. And these things are not separate or distinct, but rather intimately tied together. And I just think that's such a beautiful thing.
Well,
yes,
we're bringing to the Presbyterian and our church the Right to Be organization, which we're going to be training people, and hopefully us will sign up, in how bystander intervention when you see xenophobia, racism, sexism, bystander intervention, be trained so that you know how to intervene properly.
awesome. Well, that's something, if you're interested to talk to Richard, or if you're interested in joining Hope, to talk to Richard or Lee or anyone else that's involved in that. But also, don't get overwhelmed. Simply saying hi, calling someone is a good place to start, and also praying. So we're going to pray together. Holy, holy, holy God, we are so grateful for this journey through your scriptures together, and so excited to begin the New Testament. And what a place to begin, but with Matthew. We give you thanks for this gospel and the message it shares with us, how it teaches us about Jesus and his teachings, and the way it calls us to care for those that are on the fringes of society. So Lord, as we read in the week ahead, open us to your boundless love. Help us to see our neighbor as you do, and help us to care for those you are calling us to care for, whether it is acting out against systemic injustices or simply listening to someone in need. Let us live out that gospel of love. We ask all these things in your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you.
All right,
Will.
friends. Gospel of Mark next week. Enjoy reading through Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you.